For more than a decade, Syria was written off as a failed state, fragmented, occupied, and economically collapsed. That story may now be ending. With Bashar al-Assad removed and Western Syria back under state control, the Syrian army is pushing east, dismantling YPG-PKK rule over terrain that could decide Syria's future. As extraordinary as the battlefield advances are, the political deal-making behind them is just as significant. This is happening through quiet coordination between Syria, Turkey, and the United States. States that were openly confronting each other not long ago. It's beginning of a successful revolution story, one where Syria restoring sovereignty, reviving its economy, and pulling itself back together. Today, we unpack what's happening, why it matters, and how the next few years could reshape the Middle East. Let's get started. Before we dive into the broader implications, we need to understand what's actually happening on the ground right now, because it's extraordinary. The Syrian army is currently engaged in operations to liberate its eastern territories from SDF and PKK control. And it's happening with coordination between Turkey and the United States. Think about how remarkable that is. Turkey has spent years demanding that the US stop supporting the SDF, which Ankara view as a terrorist extension of the PKK. These were fundamentally opposing positions that created constant tensions between the two biggest NATO allies. Turkish-American relations were severely strained over Syria, particularly over the SDF. But now, with Trump back in the White House and decision to closely collaborate with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, things have shifted. There appears to be an explicit coordination that allows Syrian forces to move into these eastern territories. Why does this matter so much? Because eastern Syria isn't just an empty desert. It contains Syria's most valuable oil and gas fields, resources that have been outside Damascus' control for years. These energy resources are critical for Syria's economic recovery, for providing electricity to Syrian cities, for generating revenue that could fund construction. Without control of these resources, Syria remains economically crippled, dependent on external support, unable to provide basic services to its population. With these resources, Syria has a real chance at economic viability. This is potentially the missing piece that could transform Syria from a fragmented, failed state into a functioning country again. And that transformation is what makes Syria the ultimate test case for regional cooperation. To understand why Syria has become so critical, we need to step back and look at what makes it unique in the broader regional context. Syria is where all contradictions of Middle East politics converge. It's a microcosmos of every major regional tension, every power struggle, every competing vision for the Middle East future. Turkey pursuing security interests along its border, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states trying to counter Iranian influence, Iran itself deeply invested in the Assad government, Russia protecting its Mediterranean foothold, the United States with its own complex interests, and Israel conducting airstrikes whenever it perceives threats. Syria is the one place where all these actors' interests intersect, clash, and potentially converge. But here is why current developments make it an even more critical test case. We are witnessing whether a successful revolution story can emerge from Syria's tragedy. And here's the key insight. This transformation cannot happen without Turkish-Syria cooperation. For years, Turkey and Syria were adversaries. Turkey backed opposing groups fighting Assad. Damascus accused Ankara of supporting terrorism and violating Syrian sovereignty. The relationship was completely broken. But now, Following the overthrow of Assad by a Turkey-backed opposition movement and the rise of Ahmed al-Shara to the presidency, Ankara and Damascus are operating in full coordination. Relations between Turkey and Syria have been restored on the basis of strategic alignment and brotherhood, an outcome that has proven transformative not only for both countries, but for the wider region. Now let's examine Turkey's position in all of this, because Turkish policy has been absolutely central to recent developments. For Turkey, the Syria question is deeply personal and immediate. Turkey shares a 900-kilometer border with Syria. What happens in Syria directly impacts Turkish security, Turkish economy, and Turkish domestic politics. First, there is the refugee crisis. Turkey hosts approximately 3.6 million Syrian refugees, more than any country in the world. This has created enormous strain. Economically, hosting millions of refugees costs billions annually. Socially, it's created tensions in Turkish cities where refugees have settled. Politically, it's become a major issue, with opposing parties demanding refugees return and even some of Erdogan's supporters questioning the policy. Turkey desperately needs a stable Syria where refugees can safely return. That requires economic opportunity, security, and basic services in Syria. Second, there is the PKK. Turkey views the PKK as an existential terrorist threat. The organization has waged an insurgency in Turkey for decades, costing tens of thousands of lives. So when YPG forces offshoot of the PKK established autonomous control in northern and eastern Syria, Ankara saw it as a strategic threat. Turkey now is focused on ensuring that Syrian Kurdish forces are integrated into Syrian state structures. The current coordination regarding eastern territories reflects this evolution. Third, Turkey and Syria's political and economic future. Turkey has invested enormously in Syria, politically, militarily, economically. Turkish companies are involved in reconstruction in northern areas. Turkey has detailed knowledge of Syrian dynamics from years of engagement. The restoration of brotherly Turkish-Syrian relations solves multiple problems for Turkey. It provides a framework for addressing the refugee issues cooperatively. It creates mechanisms for border security that don't require a permanent Turkish military presence in Syria. It opens economic opportunity in Syrian reconstruction, and it allows Turkey to help shape Syria's political evolution. For this reason, Turkey has become a key facilitator of Syria's potential reintegration, both territorially and regionally. Success in Syria would create momentum for cooperation elsewhere. In Iraq, where Turkey and Gulf states also have converging interests in preventing Iranian domination and supporting stability, the Syrian model could be applied. Turkish-Iraqi cooperation on broader security, water issue, and economic matters could deepen. In Yemen, where Saudi Arabia has already intervened last week and prevented further fragmentation of the country backed by the UAE. More broadly, it demonstrates that the Middle East doesn't have to be defined by perpetual conflict, that win-win outcomes are possible, and that regional actors can solve regional problems. The restoration of brotherly Turkish-Syrian relations specifically would be transformative because Turkey and Syria, when cooperating, anchor the Middle East. They connect the Arab world to Turkey and through Turkey to Europe. Their cooperation enables all sorts of economic and political possibilities. Imagine a trade corridor from the Gulf through Iraq and Syria to Turkey and Europe. Syria reconstruction funded by Gulf capital, built by Turkish contractors employing Syrian labor. Regional security arrangement where Turkey, Syria, Iraq and Gulf states coordinate on counter-terrorism and border control. This is the vision of a peaceful Middle East, one where cooperation replaces confrontation, where economic interdependence creates incentives for stability, where countries focus on development rather than destruction. We need to be realistic here about the challenges. because despite these promising developments, success is far from guaranteed. First, the situation in eastern Syria remains extremely complex. While there is apparently coordination between Damascus, Ankara and Washington, actually implementing the transition of control involves enormous practical challenges. And then Israel continues to conduct airstrikes in Syria whenever it perceives threats to its security, particularly Iranian weapons transfers or entrenchment. These operations could destabilize any fragile political process. For Syria's stabilization to succeed, there needs to be some understanding that prevents constant Israeli military action. Then economic recovery will take time. Even with control of oil and gas fields, the infrastructure has been damaged by years of war. Production needs to be restored, markets need to be accessible. Syria needs massive reconstruction funds, and more importantly, it needs social reconciliation, which is enormously difficult. Syria has experienced profound trauma. Communities have fought each other, atrocities have been committed on all sides, millions have been displaced or killed. Healing these wounds while building inclusive government structure that give all communities a stake in the future is perhaps the hardest challenge of all. So Syria is at a historic crossroads. Right now there is a genuine reason for cautious optimism, but enormous challenges remain and nothing is guaranteed. Syria's future is being written right now, and that future will shape the entire Middle East for generations to come. Thanks for watching and see you in the next episode.